If you have ever loved someone so much that you would trade your own heartbeat for theirs, this story is for you. Stay until the end, because what this father does for his daughter will break you open. And if it moves you even half as much as it moved me while writing it, please hit like and subscribe, because stories like this one deserve to be heard by more than just us. Daniel Reyes had learned, over the last 6 years, that grief does not knock politely and then leave. It moves in. It rearranges the furniture of a man's life and dares him to complain. He had been 29 years old when his wife, Elena, died in a hospital corridor that smelled of antiseptic and wilted flowers. And he had walked out of that building holding a car seat with a 2-week-old baby in it, and no idea, none at all, how a person was supposed to survive the next hour, let alone the next decade. But he had survived it. That was the strange, stubborn miracle of it. He had survived it one diaper, one fever, one late-night feeding at a time, until the baby became a toddler. And the toddler became a little girl with Elena's exact laugh, a laugh that arrived a half-second before the joke was even finished, as if her whole body agreed with happiness before her mind caught up. Her name was Sofia. She was 7 years old now, missing her 2 front teeth, obsessed with a stray orange cat she had named Biscuit, and she was, without question or competition, the entire architecture of Daniel's life. He worked 2 jobs to keep that architecture standing. Mornings he drove a delivery route for a regional freight company, hauling boxes of auto parts and restaurant supplies across 140 miles of state highway before the sun was even fully up. Evenings, 3 nights a week, he worked security at a warehouse on the edge of town, walking the same gray corridors under humming fluorescent lights, trying not to fall asleep standing up. He did not complain about any of it. He had made a promise to Elena in that hospital corridor, a promise he had never spoken aloud to another living soul, that their daughter would never once feel the absence of a parent as a lack. She would feel loved twice as hard, to make up for the mother she would never remember. To understand what Daniel would do that September, it helps to understand the years that came before it, the long, unremarkable stretch of ordinary devotion that most people never hear about, because it does not make headlines. There was no single grand gesture in those years. There was only repetition, the kind that slowly builds a person's character the way water shapes stone, patient and invisible until the day it suddenly is not. When Sofia was an infant, Daniel taught himself to sleep in 90-minute increments, waking at the faintest change in her breathing on the baby monitor, because he could not shake the fear, irrational and yet unshakable, that if he slept too deeply, he would somehow fail to hear her need him. When she was a toddler prone to ear infections, he learned to hold a thermometer, a washcloth, and a crying child all at once while dialing a pediatrician's after-hours line with his elbow. When she started kindergarten and cried every morning at drop-off for the first 6 weeks, he took to arriving 15 minutes early so he could sit with her on the bench by the flagpole. Not saying much, just being a solid, unhurried presence until she was ready to walk through the doors on her own terms rather than his. He was not, by his own account, an unusually gifted father. He burned dinner more often than he would like to admit. He did not know how to braid hair and had, on more than one occasion, resorted to watching video tutorials in the school parking lot at 7 in the morning while Sofia sat patiently in the back seat, narrating instructions she had picked up from a friend's mother. He missed 2 parent-teacher conferences in her kindergarten year because of scheduling conflicts at the warehouse, and he still, years later, kept a small folded note of apology Sofia had written him afterward, forgiving him in the uncomplicated, generous way small children forgive the people they love, a note that read simply, "It's okay, Daddy, you always come to the important stuff." What he lacked in polish, he made up for in a kind of dogged, unglamorous constancy. He was there. Every day, in the small ways that rarely get photographed or celebrated, he was there, and it was that accumulated, decade-shaping there-ness, more than any single dramatic act, that had quietly built the man who would, One Tuesday afternoon. Look at a burning building and understand, without a flicker of hesitation, exactly where he needed to be. It was late September, and the leaves along Maple Street had just begun their slow burn into gold. When the day started, that would end up dividing Daniel's life into a clean, permanent before and after. He remembered every detail of that morning with the terrible clarity that trauma seems to etch into memory. Sofia had insisted on wearing her yellow raincoat, even though the sky was clear, because Biscuit liked the sound the fabric made, she said. And animals had opinions about clothing. Everyone knew that. Daniel had laughed, actually laughed, a real laugh, the kind he did not have many of some weeks. And he had walked her the 4 blocks to Lyndale Elementary, holding her small hand in his, listening to her narrate an elaborate story about a cat kingdom hidden beneath the school playground. He kissed the top of her head at the gate, the way he did every single day, and told her he loved her to the moon, and she told him, as she always did, that she loved him to the moon, and then all the way back again. Because coming back mattered more than going. He watched her walk through the doors. He had no way of knowing that would be the last ordinary morning for a very long time. The call came at 1:47 in the afternoon. While Daniel was 50 miles outside of town on his delivery route, and the number on his phone belonged to Lyndale Elementary, his stomach dropped before he even answered, the way a body sometimes knows before the mind is told. The school secretary's voice was too calm, the practiced calm of someone reading from a script designed not to cause panic on a phone line, and that controlled calm terrified him more than shouting would have. There had been a fire, an electrical fault in the cafeteria kitchen, feeding into insulation that should have been replaced a decade earlier, had ignited sometime around 1:30. Most of the school had evacuated without incident, but there had been a mechanical failure in one of the fire doors on the second floor, the one leading to the west stairwell. The stairwell Sofia's class used for their afternoon reading period in the school library, and a handful of children, along with one teacher, had been unable to get out through the smoke before the corridor became impassable. Daniel did not remember pulling his truck over. He did not remember the 90 minutes it took him to drive back into town, weaving through traffic he would later be told. He ran through several intersections against the light. He remembered arriving to a street cordoned off with yellow tape, fire trucks with their ladders extended against a building wearing a crown of black smoke, and a crowd of parents standing in a loose, terrified knot, some of them already sobbing, some of them frozen and silent in the particular way that fear sometimes looks like calm from the outside. A firefighter, exhausted and soot-streaked, was explaining to the gathered families that the interior stairwell had partially collapsed, that 6 children and their teacher were confirmed trapped on the second floor near the library, that the fire department's equipment could not currently reach that section of the building because the exterior fire escape had buckled in the heat, and that they were working on an alternate approach, but that every approach carried risk, and every minute mattered. Daniel heard the word library, and every other word in the English language momentarily left his brain. Sofia's afternoon reading period. Sofia was in that library. He would tell people, later, much later, once he was capable of telling the story at all, that what happened next did not feel like a decision. Decisions implied deliberation, a weighing of options, a person standing at a fork in a road choosing one path over another. This did not feel like that. This felt like his body simply already knowing, the way it had known to reach out and catch Sofia the day she took her first wobbling steps, before his mind had finished processing that she was falling. He crossed the barrier tape. A police officer grabbed his arm, and Daniel, gentle by nature, mild-mannered by every account anyone who knew him would ever give, did something he had never done before in his life. He pulled free with a strength that surprised them both, and he ran. He would later learn from a firefighter named Marcus Webb, who became something like a lifelong friend after that day, that there was a service ladder bolted to the rear of the building, an old maintenance access that predated the school's official fire code updates. one that the fire department's own equipment inventory did not have documented, and therefore had not immediately considered. Daniel had worked a summer job doing maintenance on that very building 8 years earlier, before Sofia was even born, back when he was saving money for Elena's engagement ring. He remembered that ladder the way you remember the layout of your childhood home, in your hands and feet before your conscious mind can even name it. He climbed. Smoke was pouring from a window above him in slow, oily coils, and the metal rungs were hot enough that he felt his palms blister through his work gloves. And somewhere below him, he could hear Marcus Webb shouting at him to stop, to wait for the department's team, that it was not safe. And Daniel did not stop, because safe was a word that had stopped applying the moment someone told him his daughter was trapped behind smoke. He reached a window on the second floor, one of the old classroom windows with the heavy iron latches, and he broke the glass with his elbow, wrapping his forearm in his jacket first in an instinct he would never fully explain, and he pulled himself through into a room that was already low on visibility, gray-white smoke pooling along the ceiling and creeping steadily downward. He found them in the library, 6 children pressed together beneath a reading table where their teacher, a 26-year-old named Priya Nair in her second year of teaching, had positioned them with the exact instinctive wisdom of someone who had, in a single terrifying afternoon, become far braver than her job description had ever asked her to be. She had wet paper towels from the library's small sink pressed over the children's mouths and noses, and she was talking to them in a low, steady voice, telling them a story about brave knights, keeping panic at bay with narrative the way some people keep it at bay with prayer. Sofia looked up when Daniel came through the smoke, and even now, telling this part of the story is the part that makes people who knew Daniel go quiet, because what she said, in a small, smoke-roughened voice, was not, "I'm scared," or "help me." What she said was, "Daddy, you found the cat kingdom," because in the haze and the heat, a 7-year-old's mind had reached for the only framework big enough to hold what was happening. And what was happening was that her father had appeared like something out of a story, exactly when the story needed him most. There was no time for reunion. Daniel had Priya and the children moving in under 90 seconds, passing the youngest, a 5-year-old named Marcus Chen, through the broken window first into the arms of a firefighter who had, by then, gotten a proper ladder into position below. One by one, the children went through. Sofia went fourth, and Daniel felt something in his chest unclench for the first time since the phone call. Watching her small, yellow raincoated form disappear down into waiting arms, safe, alive, out. He was helping Priya toward the window, the last 2 out, when the ceiling above the library's reading nook, weakened by heat and structural stress no one outside had been able to see, gave way. He would spend the next 11 days in a medically induced coma. The official injury report, which Sofia would not read until she was 17 years old and demanded to see it, listed a fractured pelvis, 3 broken ribs, second-degree burns across 60% of his back and shoulders, and smoke inhalation severe enough that doctors told the family, gently, carefully, in the specific vocabulary reserved for the worst conversations, that they should prepare for the possibility that he would not wake up, and that if he did, the man who woke up might not be entirely the man who had climbed that ladder. For 11 days, Sofia sat in a hospital waiting room with her grandmother, Daniel's mother, Carmen, who had driven 6 hours through the night the moment she got the call. Sofia would not sleep in the hotel the hospital arranged. She slept in the waiting room chairs, curled against Carmen's side, still wearing, for the first 3 days, the yellow raincoat because she had somehow decided, with the fierce, illogical faith of a child, that if she took it off, something would go wrong, that the coat was somehow load-bearing in a way she could not explain, and no adult tried very hard to argue her out of. In the hospital, in those first uncertain days when doctors would not commit to a prognosis beyond careful, guarded language, Carmen kept a kind of quiet vigil of her own, one most people never learned about. She sat by her son's bed each night after Sofia had finally, exhaustedly, fallen asleep in the waiting room chairs, and she talked to him, softly, about nothing in particular, about his father, who had passed when Daniel was 12, about the garden she kept back home, about the particular stubbornness Daniel had possessed since he was a toddler, a stubbornness she had once found exhausting and now found herself praying to, as if it were the very thing that might pull him back. You have never once, in your whole life, let go of something you loved, she told him on the 6th night, holding his bandaged hand as carefully as she could. Don't start now. The hospital staff, too, became unlikely witnesses to the shape of what Daniel had done. A respiratory therapist named Angela Ruiz, who monitored his lung function twice daily through those 11 days, later told a local reporter that she had cared for burn and smoke inhalation patients for 9 years and had rarely seen injuries so severe paired with vitals so stubbornly, almost defiantly, stable, as though some part of him had simply decided in advance that this particular fight was not the one that would end him. She did not put much stock in things she couldn't measure, she said. But she had started to believe, watching the numbers on Daniel's chart refuse to fully collapse, even in the worst hours, that a person's reasons for living could sometimes show up on a monitor whether medicine had a name for it or not. The story of what Daniel had done spread through the town, and then further, the way stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things sometimes do. A local news segment became a regional one. A photograph, taken by a bystander, of Daniel's silhouette against the smoke-black window as he passed a child through to safety, was shared and reshared until it belonged, in some sense, to strangers all over the country who had never met him and never would. People who found themselves crying at their kitchen tables, looking at a photo of a man they didn't know, thinking about their own children, their own fathers, their own private, complicated definitions of love. On the 11th day, Daniel opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was not the ceiling, or the monitors, or the IV line taped to the back of his hand. It was Sofia's face, 6 inches from his own, because she had climbed up onto the edge of the hospital bed the moment the nurses stepped out. Careful of his bandages in the specific, focused way a child can be careful when something matters enough. She was still wearing the yellow raincoat. Her 2 front teeth were still missing, and she said, in the same small voice she had used in the smoke-filled library, "You came back. You said you'd come back." It took Daniel 3 weeks to be able to speak in full sentences without his throat catching on the scar tissue forming along his airway. It took 4 months of physical therapy before he could lift Sofia off the ground again, something he had done every day of her life without thinking about it, and which he now had to relearn like a language, one careful motion at a time. It took the better part of a year before the skin grafts across his back stopped requiring daily care, before he stopped waking at 3 in the morning from dreams that were not quite nightmares but were not restful either. Dreams made of heat and smoke and the specific, singular fear of a door he could not get through fast enough. But there was a strange gift buried inside all of that suffering. One Daniel would spend years trying to articulate to people who asked him about that day, usually with a kind of hush in their voice, as though the story itself were sacred and needed to be handled carefully. The gift was this. He had spent 6 years since Elena's death terrified, in some low, constant hum beneath everything else, that he was not enough. Not enough of a parent, not enough of a provider, not enough to make up, single-handedly, for the mother Sofia would never have. That fear had shaped so much of how he moved through the world, working 2 jobs not only for the money, but as a kind of penance, a proof he kept offering up to an invisible judge who never seemed satisfied. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, he had found out, in the most absolute terms a person can find out anything, exactly what he was capable of when it mattered most. He had climbed a ladder made of memory and desperation, walked into a building that professionals with proper equipment were still calculating how to safely enter, and he had gotten 6 children and their teacher out alive. Whatever fear had lived in him about being enough did not survive that fire. It could not. It had been answered, completely and finally, in the language of action rather than words. The town threw a celebration for Daniel and for Priya Nair, 6 months after the fire, once he was strong enough to stand for the length of a ceremony. They renamed the small park behind Lindale Elementary the Reyes Nair Community Garden, and planted 6 young maple trees there, 1 for each rescued child, their small canopies still bare and hopeful against the sky. Marcus Webb, the firefighter who had shouted at Daniel to wait and had then, when Daniel didn't, been the one to catch each child coming down from that window, became a regular presence at the Reyes household, showing up some Sundays with a bag of groceries and no particular agenda beyond sitting on the porch and watching Sofia chase Biscuit through the yard. Priya Nair, for her part, went back to teaching the following fall, though she requested and was granted a permanent transfer to the ground floor classroom, and she kept, framed on her desk for the rest of her career, a drawing Sofia made for her, 2 stick figures, one large and one small, standing beneath a smiling sun, with the words, "Thank you for the story about nights," written underneath in a 7-year-old's careful, uneven print. Sofia is 17 now. She still has Biscuit, older and grayer and considerably more dignified than the kitten who once demanded a specific raincoat's cooperation, though he has, admittedly, mellowed into the kind of cat who mostly wants to be left alone on a warm windowsill. She has her mother's laugh, the one that arrives before the joke finishes. And increasingly, people who knew Daniel as a young man say she's starting to have her father's particular stillness too. The quality of a person who does not talk much about what they would do for the people they love, because talking was never really the point. The doing was the point. She still has the yellow raincoat too, though it has not fit her in a decade. It hangs in her closet, a small folded relic, and every September, on the anniversary of the fire, she takes it out and sets it on her windowsill for the day. Not as a display, not for anyone else to see, but as a private ritual whose meaning she has never had to explain to Daniel, because he understands it without being told. Some things, in a family built by love and near loss in equal measure, do not require explanation. They simply require remembering. Daniel still walks with a slight stiffness in cold weather, a permanent signature the fire left in his hip that physical therapy could improve but never fully erase. He has scars across his back and shoulders that Sofia has seen exactly twice in her life, both times by accident, both times met not with horror but with a kind of quiet, fierce tenderness that told him, more clearly than any words could, that she understood, at least in outline, the shape of what he had traded for her that day. He still works, though only one job now, having been promoted at the freight company to a dispatch position that keeps him off the highway and home most evenings, a change he credits, with characteristic understatement, to wanting to be around for dinner. He does not think of himself as brave. When people ask him about the fire, and people still do, even years later, strangers who recognize him from that photograph that once traveled further than he ever has, he tends to say some version of the same thing, that there was never really a decision to make. That loving someone the way he loved his daughter did not leave room for a different outcome. That any parent in that same position, standing at the base of that ladder with that particular fear in their chest, would have understood instantly and completely that there simply was no version of themselves that could have chosen to stand still. But those who were there that day, who watched a delivery driver with no fire training and no safety equipment climb into a burning building because his daughter was inside it, know that this is not entirely true. Not everyone would have climbed that ladder. Not everyone could have. What Daniel did that Tuesday afternoon was not simply what any parent would do. It was what one particular parent did, forged by 6 years of quiet, unglamorous devotion, by a promise made in a hospital corridor to a woman who was no longer there to see it kept, by every diaper and fever and late shift and bedtime story that came before the fire. all of it converging, in the end, into a single, unhesitating act. Sofia keeps a photograph on her nightstand, not the famous one that strangers shared online, but a smaller, quieter one. Her father. Weeks after he came home from the hospital, sitting on their back porch in the last gold light of a September evening, Sofia curled against his side, both of them looking, not at the camera, but at each other, in the specific way people look at each other when they have already said, in every way that matters, everything there is to say. Every year, on the anniversary of the fire, the 6 children who were once pulled from that library, now teenagers themselves, some of them nearly grown, gather at the Reyes Nair Community Garden along with their families. The maple trees, once bare saplings barely taller than the children they were planted for, now stand tall enough to cast real shade across the benches beneath them. Marcus Chen, the 5-year-old Daniel handed through the window first, is 16 now and has told anyone who will listen that he intends to become a firefighter, a plan his parents receive with the particular blend of pride and terror unique to raising a child who has already, once, needed saving. Priya Nair usually brings a folder of old classroom photographs, and the group spends an hour simply talking, not about the fire itself, which, by unspoken agreement, they rarely dwell on directly, but about ordinary things, school, sports, the small dramas of growing up, as if the gathering's real purpose is not to remember the danger, but to quietly, faithfully prove, year after year, that they are all still here to talk about anything at all.